Well, welcome to our second program of the season. I'm Bob Johnson, longtime director of the Enterprise Forum. I just wanted to introduce, we had an election recently. I wanted to introduce our new officers for the coming year. Craig Cummings is the chair. He was the vice chair formerly. Craig, stand up so we can see. That's who you complained to. And then Melissa Marino, who is going to be the vice chair this year. And our other two officers, Dave Cronin and John Selmans, are not here, I don't believe. It's my pleasure to introduce Frank Foster, who is with DFJ Frontiers. DFJ is one of the really blue chip venture firms around the country, been in business a long time, and before that was preceded by Draper, who was one of the original venture capitalists. You can read all about Frank here. This is a very sophisticated program that he's put together tonight. It's only for mature audiences, and you'll understand that there's a lot of subtlety that goes on in the boardroom. Frank?
Great, thank you very much. Well, good evening, and I'm pleased to get the chance to actually lead, this discussion on a topic that I believe is sort of absolutely critical to the sort of successful relationship between entrepreneurs and investors. And having been a CEO twice and now having managed 5 venture funds, I've seen the issues on both sides and particularly how they manifest themselves in the boardroom. I know that many of you here who are entrepreneurs look at a board as sort of a necessary evil. And those of you who are investors, look at the board as sort of like the watchtower warden, your chance to hopefully control what goes on. And you know what? Neither of these type of approaches really is very likely to produce a successful outcome. So I thought that what we try to do today as a group is, understand what is actually the role of a board for these type of companies, what it should be, and approaches that work and approaches that don't. So to attack this subject, I think I pulled together a pretty amazing group of people who have some, deep experience and insight into these issues. So first of all, we have Pascal Levinson, who is the managing director of Levinson Ventures and of Generation Strategic Advisors. Pascal is really one of the country's recognized experts on the subject of venture-backed boards and served on the governance committee for the National Venture Capital Association. He's also a very successful venture investor, having been an investor in Commerce One, Intuitive Surgical, and Big Fix, all really big successes. We also have Jim Schraith, who was formerly the COO of Compaq and the president of AST Research, but more recently has a company that actually called Board Evals that focuses on boards and how they can really measure themselves and work much more effectively. And then finally, we have John McFarlane, who's really one of our local success stories and recognized as one of the top CEOs in the area, having built Software.com and now Sonos. So I think we've got a great team. Pascal's going to lead us off on the subject. Then I'm going to ask both Jim and John to weigh in with their opinions. I'll ask them a couple of questions, and then we really get to the important part of this, which is to get a chance for all you guys to hear what they have to say and ask questions, because that's really what the whole MIT Forum should be about. So with that, I'll turn it over to Pascal.
Thanks, Frank. And I'm really looking forward to a lively discussion among the panel members and also with all of you. So let me just get the slides going here first. And what I'm going to talk about is communication, breakdowns in communication, and the importance of process. But also, I'm going to talk about different perceptions of reality. And I think that to start, it's always useful to think about the matrix. And some of you may remember that in the Matrix you could take the blue pill and basically continue to live in unreality and denial and believe whatever you want to believe. But if you took the red pill, you actually would go down the rabbit hole. And in the context of boards of directors, the board and understanding the role of the board, your role as a board member, and what the consequences are of dysfunction on the board is absolutely essential. And I will argue, and it's been my experience, I have lost a lot of money being a member of dysfunctional boards. So I figured, and I started writing about this 12 years ago, that maybe if I called on a bunch of people that I knew and respected, and we all collaborated, we could actually develop a common body of knowledge on the topic. And the slides that follow are a distillation of that work. And I have 3 white papers that are in the public domain on the topic and that you may find useful as well. So before I continue, so how many people in the audience have experience as directors of public or private corporations? Good, so we have a good number, I'd say more than half. So first question, why do boards matter? First of all, if you're a CEO, you work for your board. This is a very fundamental, basic thing that actually often many CEOs don't understand. And so the flip side of that is that, and this gets back to this whole concept of managing your board. It's like, you got to manage your board. You absolutely do, because managed properly, your board will work for you. So whether you have served as a nonprofit director, and if it's on a community board, or your church, a school board, or whether it's a large corporation, the fact is that as a director, you do incur specific legal obligations and liabilities which you cannot minimize. And a lot of people on private boards or nonprofits, they forget that. And I think that the dynamics on nonprofit boards are even more complicated because everybody's there trying to do a good thing. And so what do you do when people are there trying to be good citizens and they're doing a horrible job and you should get rid of them? That makes it can be very uncomfortable. If you're a company shareholder, a bad board, and it's absolutely been my experience that a single bad director can set in motion a chain of events that can ruin your company. The good side of this is that if you have a good board, you can actually harness all of those resources and improve the company's ability to be successful. When I started speaking on this topic some years ago, I remember a CEO stood up and he said, well, you know, you're overstating the value of the board. You know, it's like, it's the CEO that matters. And I agree. I think that the CEO absolutely makes a far bigger contribution than the directors, and that person should. But if you have a bad board can neutralize a great CEO's efforts. And that is something that you cannot ignore. So why are many boards ineffective? The fact is, there's some great boards out there. There are some horrible boards out there, but most boards are not optimized. So the question, and this, if you leave here with only one thought after this evening, I hope it is this one, the answer to this question. What is the most common mistake that boards of directors make? It's presuming that there is consensus when it does not, in fact, exist. That's it. It's like, if you actually keep this in mind, you will solve most of your problems on the board. And so what does that mean? It's really simple. You know, it's like if the 4 of us and the CEO were the directors of a company, is that we show up at the board meeting and nobody bothered to find out what everybody thought. And I've got to tell you, in Silicon Valley, this happens all the time. Why? Because people are too busy, or they don't care, and they don't care about the junior director who's a director, but you know, so they own 3% of the company. And so the large shareholder doesn't care. Well, you know, this creates huge problems and misalignments, and we're going to talk about misalignments in a second. So the other thing is, up and to the right never happens in a straight line. There's a few companies that have absolutely done that, wonderful, you know, but you can't build a lifetime or a career on that. And in my experience, you know, it's a zigzag. And so companies that I thought were in trouble turn out being huge home runs, and the companies that I was sure were going to be great winners turn out to be disasters. One of the issues that many companies and investors face is that they actually don't self-diagnose their own level of maturity sufficiently or accurately. So this here just basically points out that when you're looking at a company and you're thinking about what your role should be, put that in the context of where the company is in its own development, and therefore how important a role should you be playing as a director. You know, for some companies, you can be hands-off. For other companies, you really need to be engaged. And sometimes there are misunderstandings between what the CEO believes the maturity of the company is, whereas the reality is different, and the directors might feel differently, and then you get clashes. I've found that many investors and entrepreneurs misunderstand this issue. So I'm going to spend a few minutes now on the topic of what is exactly the role of the board. Well, first of all, it is to maximize shareholder value for all of the company's shareholders. But it extends beyond that. You also want directors who can attract, recruit, and retain talent. Right? They should be magnets that help the management team bring on more people. Also, they should be mentors to the executive team. And hopefully, they should have business insight, right? I mean, Frank has been on many boards. He's invested in many companies. Most entrepreneurs, again, a super successful serial entrepreneur might have 5 companies in their career, right? If we've got 30, 50 companies in our portfolios over several years, hopefully, we've learned something from that experience that we can bring to the table. If not, you should throw us out of the room. Also, oversight. And this is probably the biggest thing that is misunderstood, particularly by management teams. This gets back to fiduciary duty. There is a very strong duty of oversight, and we have to be given information as directors. We have to demand that information. And there have been lawsuits over people who have said, well, I didn't know, right? There are a lot of Enron, I didn't know people, right? A lot of people at Tyco didn't know, right? But the fact is, you have to know. It is not enough to show up and say you were in the room, but they didn't tell you. You actually have to show that you exercise oversight. All directors have to be fiduciaries for all shareholders. And this, I find, is a big issue with management teams where you have first-time entrepreneurs on the board. They're like, oh yeah, no, I represent the common. No, you don't. If you're a director, you have to actually put yourself in the shoes of the other people and say, am I doing something that's in my best interest and hurting others deliberately? Can I live with that decision? The hiring and firing of the CEO, ratifying officer selection, these are really important duties. Reviewing and confirming company objectives and strategy, very important. Again, oversight and identifying problems, because sometimes the management teams get very close to the issues, but they can't step back and really get a sense of what's really happening here. So again, if you're a good director, you can provide context. The whole issue of misalignment is very significant, and there are 4 main misalignments that occur over and over again. And in the venture capital business, these are particularly pronounced because in VC we have institutionalized conflicts of interest. Just think of preferred stock versus common stock. So the economic misalignments come to bear when you have companies missing plan, and then you have down rounds, you have rounds with multiple preferences, and so suddenly you'll have a board of directors where, you know, Frank might make money at a price where I lose most everything, right? And the management team might be left out, and there might be a flat spot where you could go from 50 million to 100 million, and you could have investors at the table who are not better off even if you sold at a $50 million higher price. Then fiduciary misalignments have to do with people not understanding that they have obligations that cross their own economic interests. Strategic misalignments have to do when you bring in corporate investors. And again, it is a known playbook trick in venture capital that, again, you bring in some strategic money, And you have the fake board meeting and the real board meeting, right? And so you have the observer from the corporation in. Then, of course, you say that either the board meeting's over or you go into closed session, and then you actually have the real board meeting. So this causes lots of problems, and also strategic investors will have a big chunk of the company, but they don't really care about the economics necessarily. They may care mostly about you delivering that special product, which is why they invested, or they care about seeing you on the ropes so that they can buy you at a low price. The worst, however, is emotional misalignment. And this has to do with ego, self-deception, and people just not being willing to have the self-awareness to know when they're in over their head. And so you will have people who are absolutely stubborn, and they will not take constructive input, and this can destroy a company. So, and I know I'm sure we'll be talking about this, the whole issue of evaluation of the CEO and self-evaluations of boards is critical. It is a New York Stock Exchange requirement. It is a recommended best practice for NASDAQ companies. In Silicon Valley, even today, only 20% of companies actually are doing these types of evaluations, and it's not right. There is no reason to avoid CEO evaluations. And it has to do with people who are afraid of the scrutiny, and it's just, it has to be addressed. I'll spend a few minutes on early warning signs in the board-CEO relationship. It's been the experience that I've had, and also a lot of other venture capitalists who have contributed to the work that I'm sharing with you now, that things like rejection of board input at board meetings, disengagement from daily operations, highly emotional behavior during the boardroom meeting, cutting off information flow from the board. So if you're asking for access, I have a situation right now where I'm actually serving as a fiduciary for a large investor in a company, a technology company, where in the board meeting we requested the ability to do some exit interviews with several executives that have left recently. CEO's said he would and now is refusing to, and I just got an email half an hour ago with like these made-up reasons why he won't let an independent person actually find out why these people left. I mean, it's unconscionable, absolutely unconscionable. And then also passing the buck, right? Again, the number one favorite whipping boy for every CEO when they start missing sales is, of course, the VP of sales, the number one most replaced person in a company. Okay, ineffective boards fail to communicate. And so, to me, a big sign of problems, and I had this situation right now, refusal by the management team to join in a dinner prior to the board meeting, or a breakfast prior to the board meeting, right? We're too tired. We're coming in from far, especially when you verify that that's not true, right? Huge problem. Then failing to act, just not going forth. Failing to reconcile diverging viewpoints, saying, oh yeah, no, reasonable men can disagree on this. No, they can't. You cannot have complete disagreement on the strategy of a company and expect it to actually go forward. Then avoiding conflict, refusing to address head-on what the real problems are. And some tactical things, excessively long board meetings that are really a waste of time. And then, of course, people who are, shopping on Amazon during the board meeting. I had that one happen a couple of years ago. That venture partnership blew up, fraud, and taken over by a caretaker within 12 months. Effective boards actually do establish clear and mutual understanding of expectations between the directors and the CEO. And that's, again, simple concept, but it's actually a big deal. And I can tell you of venture firms that have deliberately misled entrepreneurs in order to get them to take their money. And actually, we know at least one firm that does that as a matter of trade, right? So good boards will conduct formal annual performance evaluations of the CEO. And also, they're happy to have executive sessions among non-executive board members only. In fact, that should be a requirement. You should build it into your board schedule, even if you have nothing to talk about. Because I have yet to have one board meeting where we didn't have anything to talk about at that time. You also want to have directors who actually don't mind being together. It's really a problem when you can't tolerate each other. You need to have open and honest communications and be constructive and timely about resolving differences of opinion. What this all boils down to is accountability, right? That you're willing to be accountable to the people that you're working with on the board. Ineffective directors, they have something to say even if they have nothing to say. They become disengaged because they feel nobody cares about their opinion. They don't resolve disagreements. They may not maintain regular board meeting attendance. Also, they play passive aggressive. They say yes in the board meeting and they do no afterwards, right? And then in Silicon Valley, an issue is this, especially with the stratification of Silicon Valley that's really occurred between the magnet huge funds and everyone else. When they let the smaller funds in, the smaller funds are just there because they're coattailing, and so they don't want to disagree, even if they've done more work, even if they know better, they say nothing, and that's just a disservice to everyone. Effective directors, they show up, they do the work, they don't attack the CEO when they answer their questions. They actually are comfortable communicating outside of the boardroom, and they're willing to give an outlier perspective, which is they're willing to step out a little bit and say, well, have you considered this, even though it's not within what everyone was talking about. So in closing, it's all about process. It's very important to ask and to answer the hard questions early. From the CEO's perspective, it's important to be realistic about operating forecasts and actually to be proactive about changing them, even if it's bad news. As a director, you need to put yourself in the other director's shoes. You need, I think, to be open to working with outside consultants to address team and other management issues when you actually hit a roadblock. Because in small groups, sometimes it really helps to bring someone in who has a fresh perspective. And remember, in some companies, we've been on boards for 6, 8, 10 years. And so sometimes you lose that spark that you started with. And also be creative when considering solutions. With that, I'll rejoin the panel. Thank you.
I was a little worried that Pascal might be opinionated, but, I think it came across that he's been through a few of these situations. So I might ask some of our other panelists here to just, take a moment and, Jim, why don't you start off? What are some of your thoughts maybe on what Pascal's had to say here from your experience?
What he said. I mean, it's hard to top. I think he's really crystallized very, very important topics. And to just sort of go into my own personal experience, like almost everybody, here on the panel, I've sat on dozens of boards of both public companies and private companies, 3-person boards to 30-person boards. And every board can be better. I think that's the one thing I've learned. Even the best boards I've been on, I've seen things that they can do better. And a couple of the things that I've seen from some of the best boards are in Pascal's slide deck. So I recommend that you copy these or just remember everything that has been said. A couple of things come through. So I took all that experience and started a company that actually evaluates boards of directors, and so I've got some insights. We evaluate, we process probably several hundred evaluations every year of all types of boards, and it's really interesting to see how many board members do some really boneheaded things. I mean, the BlackBerry that's out throughout the entire board meeting. And that's a big Silicon Valley,
Yes.
Venture board sort of a faux pas. But even in public company boards, it's not usually a BlackBerry because they're more iPhone kind of guys, or they have laptops. And they're on MarketWatch.com checking their portfolio, or they're looking at the stock price for the company that they're on the board of during the board meeting. And you look over and you go, boy, that's just unconscionable. The big one, and it's less of an issue that I've seen on venture-backed boards as more other boards, but an hour before the board meeting ends, oh yeah, I'm looking at the watch, when's my flight? Can I get an earlier flight? You know, they stop the meeting and say to the CEO, could you get your admin in here? I want to try and get out an hour earlier. Can we skip the executive session or things like that? So, you know, Pascal hit on almost all of these things in his slides, and I guess my advice or my counsel to those of you who are entrepreneurs and thinking about boards is keep all of these things in mind as you start boards, right? Your first board is going to be maybe just you or maybe you and your partner, but then you're going to bring on maybe an angel investor and then some VCs. So the board is going to sort of evolve over time, and watch out for these sorts of things because they can really, really hurt. A great board can help a good company, and a great board can help a bad company. A bad board can help a great company be mediocre. And to Pascal's point, it might only be one board member who does that, who really spoils it for the rest of the organization.
Great, thanks. You know, John, from the view of a CEO who's had to live with all these boards, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the whole subject of boards is absolutely a fascinating one. I'm personally passionate about how to get teams working together, and I think one of the most important teams to get working is the board. And you know, there's so much in Pascal's stuff that you probably miss three-quarters. You know, he's forgotten stuff that's really important. I'd probably take issue with his first point about process, and I'd say it's all about the right people. And you know, as an entrepreneur, you don't always get to choose your money separately from your board members. But the better you can do that, the better in everybody's interest, as long as you pick really good board members. And you know, you've got to have a notion that they'll evolve with the company's evolution, because the right board members in a company that has no revenue and it's all an idea is very different than the right board members for a company that's a growth company and really scaling, and you need really good operations expertise. And so you've really got to have an idea that the board's going to evolve just like the management team evolves to solving a different set of problems. And I think that comes out of the things that Pascal said. If you really do have good agreement up front of what the role of the board is, and I've made all the mistakes, and Pascal mentioned an investor that's bad, and entrepreneurs have a terrible, it's easy to pick the investors that have screwed up a company, but you know, there's a funny story about the Google founders, and it's a true one, when they went and got money from Kleiner Perkins and Sequoia, and they both made the Google co-founders promise they would go find a CEO. And they promised, but they didn't put it in the term sheet, and they wouldn't put it in the term sheet, and they took the money, and right after taking the money, they said, no, we're not going to look for a CEO. And two very famous people at each of those venture capital companies called each other and said, what are we going to do about this? And they both decided, well, I guess we'll just go along for the ride because we don't want to miss this investment. Now, it worked in that scenario, but the entrepreneurs can be the biggest problem for a board. I've seen so many entrepreneurs that have the attitude of, you know, it's my work, but just their money. And it just doesn't work that way. It's, you know, you have a fiduciary, you took that money, that's a contract. Whether you realized it or not, there was an implicit agreement that you're going to return back their money with a return on it that matches their expectations. And you know, if you've gone 4, 5, 6 years down the road, and you know, it'll be a hard road, but if you haven't delivered on that, that's your miss. And it doesn't mean that you're not in it together, and it doesn't mean you're a bad person or you've done a bad thing, and but you can't sit there and say, I've worked my tail off for 5 years, therefore it's all mine and none yours. And I've watched those things happen a bunch of times too. So it's a really delicate balance. You can get, and I've had, at Software.com, I had a board member. When I started Software.com, the first thing I did was put friends and coworkers on the board. Well, that was stupid. And luckily, we all had the right goals in mind. So when I realized what was going on, I asked everybody to leave, and I went out and found the best board possible. And I largely found a good set of people. But I had one that wasn't well aligned with us, and it's the example. The company was doing well, but it was a moment when it wasn't completely clear to everybody that it was going well. And, these things change in a 6-month period. You think everything is up and to the right, and then it's not, and then it's falling apart, and then 6 months later, it's even better than you thought. And so it's just amazing the inflection points that happen. But the trouble is, right in the middle of that, it's hard for everybody to see. And I had a board member that certain we should do an IPO, and there was no friggin' way the company should be doing an IPO, and pushed really hard. And we looked at it and talked to bankers, and we talked to lawyers and everything. And when I think we were getting close to having a kickoff dinner, and one of the bankers, an analyst, asked me, "So how's the visibility to the next quarter?" And I had no idea. And it hit me right then, this company is crazy to go public. And I stopped the whole process, and we had a huge battle over it. But the person fortunately left the board, and we replaced them. And the company did subsequently go public, and all went well. But I look back at that, and had we gone public right then, we could have, because the window was open and crazy things were happening. But it would have been a disaster. And it would have been the end of the company. And, that was one board member.
Did you ask that board member to leave? Or
I did.
It just
I
happened?
did. No, I asked them to leave.
Yeah.
It wasn't pretty.
Yeah.
I had to threaten to leave the company. But the right thing happened.
Yeah. I was in a similar situation with a startup where I had a board member who was representing a venture capitalist, and he was not the right board member. And you approach that as an entrepreneur, CEO, you approach that very gingerly, because you never know how they're going to react. I was lucky in my case where I went to the venture partnership and said, this guy isn't working. He's not looking at the opportunity the way the rest of us are looking at it. And coincidentally, he didn't really have a background that lined up really well. And they gave us a different partner.
Yeah.
And it was a very, very
You had a great
positive
investor.
outcome.
Yeah.
It was a great investor.
Yes.
That's a good
Yeah.
thing.
That's a great sign.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you have alignment with the investors, that's everything. And when you don't, it's
But you're scared
difficult.
out of your wits to
Yeah.
go make that
Yep.
call, aren't you?
So if I could make a suggestion, there is a new book that came out. It's within the last, I don't know, maybe 8 months. It's called The Founder's Dilemmas, and that's by Noam Wasserman from Harvard Business School, and that's a great field guidebook for entrepreneurs, and it addresses exactly the issue that you raised about, don't put your buddies on the board at the beginning. And actually some of the more useful recommendations also have to do with how do you allocate equity amongst the founders. And so, Noam advocates what he calls dynamic allocation, which I think is a really, really good idea. Yep. It's basically saying, you don't know how everybody's going to contribute on day one. So maybe you should build in some flexibility into how you do it. And so then just the quick comment on process. The types of things that I'm focusing on, because I totally agree that it's all about the people. And also it is a huge challenge you don't necessarily get the choice, right? But so some process things that I would focus on though, for example, a lot of early stage companies, they're like, oh, we're too small to do that. And so for example, we don't need to have internal controls as to how we disperse cash. And so then they don't bother to say, well, okay, so who's actually approving that check? And then so make sure that the person who approves isn't the same person who's signing. Right? Things like that. And just people say, well, this doesn't matter. But this can come back and actually be a problem later. So, and the other thing is to actually have a formal board.
Those are things where a good board helps you, because
Right.
they remind you, because it may be a process that isn't there at a certain time, needs to be later, and that's
Exactly.
what good board members do.
Yep.
Yep.
I was worried about being a moderator, but I don't think I have to worry about that.
Were you worried we were going to strangle each other, or that?
Okay, you guys, talking about it, I'd love to get some of your thoughts, whoever wants to step up on, so what is a great board? I mean, if you're thinking about it, and you can pick a stage for a company, you can do things, but what, in your experience, help the entrepreneurs here, what should they be shooting for? Pascal, if you want to take the role of being an investor thinking about it, but, it's, one of those issues, what should I be looking for?
Well, so if you're an entrepreneur, I think first of all you have to just like draw the board table and then think of what are the different skill sets that you'd like around the table, and then try and see if you actually could fill it with people who aren't duplicative of each other. You will fail, right? But that's a good way to start thinking about it, because this gets back to different people have different roles. So one person could be a domain expert in your field that can actually help you with contacts. It's the Rolodex, right? That person could be an extension of your BD team. Another person could be someone who really understands finance and can really help your CFO, or especially if you don't have a CFO and all you have is a controller, right? So thinking about those types of functions. Someone else should be highly technical. If you have a really technical thing, say, boy, this person could really be a great sounding board for me. Another person could be a great public speaker and say, well, this person could help me as a coach when I'm the spokesperson for the company. So I think those are the types of things that can make a great board.
I'd probably add to that. I mean, in addition to the functional skill sets, there's some style points that I think are important. I like board members who are, I don't want to say confrontational, but they're challenging, right? I don't want a table full of board members who, when I say we're going to go do this, they all shake their head and go, okay, we're going to go do this. I really want people, and I think it's somewhere in the one of the slides, Pascal said, board members that can take a step out and look from the outside in. So looking for board members that aren't just going to be, they're not your buddies because they worked with you at Intel and they're all going to be just like you. You want to find a board member who is, frankly, maybe the opposite of you, right? Because you want to have somebody balancing either your enthusiasm or your own strengths in certain areas. That's one thing that I've always found personally fun, actually, to have somebody who's my counterparty on the board.
Yeah, I agree. Conflict is really important, and constructive conflict.
Yes.
But there are a lot of people that judge boards by, are all the votes unanimous and do we all agree? And that's a pretty unhealthy board. Those are the things that get companies in trouble. I think conflict is important. Now, conflict that goes into the company and splits the company is not. So it's really a constructive conflict. So having people that, are domain experts and can say it appropriately, are you sure this is the right strategy? How about this one? And have a really good discussion around that. And I would say there's a whole bunch of ways you can tell if you have a great board. But the trick is getting all the elements right so that it really feels, but when you do, everybody wants to be in the board meeting. They look forward to it. The frequency of the board meetings is really important. It depends on the kind of metabolic rate of the company. Do they happen every month? Do they happen every quarter? If they're too far apart, you're re-educating the board every time on what you're doing. If they're too close together, I've never run into that before where, you have too little to talk about, but usually just because everybody has too little time to get together. Your team will tell you that board is incredible, and it's so, it's challenging to get in front of. I have to be well prepared, but they're really helpful. They'll help you recruit. I use my board all the time. I have great people. I have a finance person, which is Fred Anderson, the ex-CFO of Apple, and he interviews a bunch of the finance people. I always struggle with good CFOs, and he's really helped on that. If you're struggling with Reed Hastings, Netflix?
Yep.
Yeah, Reed once told me he went through, 20 VPs of sales one time. It was an incredible number. And one of his board members really kind of helped him find the right one and helped him mature so that he was both looking for the right person and making the right environment for the person. Because Reed is an engineer, and sometimes engineers and salespeople don't mix well. So he had to change in that circumstance, and his board member was really instrumental in that. They help promote you to partners, so they're just, they're passionate about the company, and you're bragging about them. So that you'll know if you have a great board, and you'll know if you don't. Now, what you do between those 2 points is really what matters.
No, that's great. To add just to my own experience on this one is that one of the boards I've created for a company where I was CEO, found a CEO, became chairman, and then have had a chance to really build the board. It's a life science company called Prolacta Bioscience. And we now have a board that consists of, a representative of the early stage investors who kind of have the corporate history of the company. We've got the second round of financing, and we've got the later stage investors. So we kind of have the investor side covered. But what we've been able to transition is to start bringing in terrific industry people. We have, in this case, we had the former president of Baxter is on the board. We've got the woman who built one of the most successful managed healthcare companies in the Northeast. And we've got the former president of Nestle Nutrition on the board. And we have the CEO. So you've got a really interesting balance. And one of the things, hopefully, for entrepreneurs, we say, what makes a perfect board? Like, this board is really interesting for me. I like to go to the
And
board
you
meetings.
just know it's working, right?
And
Yeah.
it crackles when it gets there because you have a nice balance of the people who look after the numbers, and then you have some of the operating people who can say, shut up, you guys, you gotta, these are the numbers, but you gotta look between them. And I have the operational experience to look between the numbers, and, you can look at it this way, but experience tells me it's this way, and it just happens to work really well. So I know a lot of entrepreneurs ask me, what is a great board? Being part of one right now, I'd use that as a model. If you can get a nice balance of people on the investor side and the operating side, it takes a long time. It took me 6 years to put this board together, but now it's really working for the company. So
I was just going to leverage on that because for as challenging as it is sometimes to be on a private company board, especially as it goes through troubles, it's actually way more fun than being on a public company board as far as I'm concerned. And those of you in the audience who raise your hand and have said you've been on a public company board probably know what I'm talking about. Because, when you're on a private company board, whether you're an investor or whether you're one of these 4 people that you brought in, you're there because you want to see the company grow and be successful and eventually either IPO or have a liquidity event or some sort of thing like that. The minute a company goes public, and we see this all the time in the public companies that we work with, the board changes dramatically. They're there, sometimes we say they're resting investing. They're there for the stock options, they're there for the quarterly payment. Half of the board meeting is spent talking about the legal, docket, and it's not talking about how do we grow the company, how do we grow shareholder value. It's really, especially after Sarbanes-Oxley, it's gotten very, very complicated to be a public company board member. Yeah. To the extent that a lot of my friends, and myself included, have gotten off all the public company boards we were on because it was just, it wasn't fulfilling, and for the company, for the CEO, it was sort of like a waste of time. A lot of public companies now are setting up separate advisory boards that can talk about the business without having to have a lawyer in the room, worrying about shareholder suits and things of that nature.
Want to, get to letting the audience ask some questions, but one of the last things I thought I'd do is, you guys have all had a lot of experience. Give us an example of something, that really hit you where you might have done something differently that you think might be useful for either the entrepreneurs or investors that are here in the audience.
Well, I think that it's a refrain in Silicon Valley that no director has ever complained of having fired a CEO too early, right? And so I think that's, I can look back at a number of occasions where we should have made the change sooner. And, it gets back to those early warning signs. And so when you see it and you start having the discussion, the second that you're looking across to the other director and you both know that you're thinking about it, you're already late.
Yeah.
So
It's really hard in a group setting to do something like that. So I agree with you, and it is a really important duty, and I'm of the belief with a entrepreneur, you shouldn't be afraid of getting fired, because the one thing you don't want to be is responsible for the company failing. You know, you've looked all these people in the eye and you've convinced them to come, and you know, there'll be times when you're not the right person, and if the board really, if you've got a good board and they're not feeling like you're the right person, then cooperate, because you don't want to be the cause of that failure. You know, trust me, I've watched that happen enough times. It's not something you want to live with. You know, the biggest mistakes I've made on the board is underestimating. I think you said something really important. It took 5 years to put the board together. Probably biggest mistakes I've made is underestimating the investment of time in getting a great board together. And, you know, aim really high. You'd be surprised. And, you know, if you ask somebody and they say no, it's nothing personal, but just keep trying. It's, if you get that magic board that takes, and it takes 5 years to put a good board together, it really does. Don't be afraid of that.
And don't be afraid to change it if it's not working.
Yeah.
You know, I think just like on the venture capital side, where you sort of sit here and think sometimes we wait too long to replace CEOs, the flip side can also be true, where
Yep.
you wait too long to change a board member.
Yeah.
You know, and Pascal hit it on it earlier. One bad board member can really destroy the value of a board meeting, and it's, I've seen it. It's worse when the board has friends of the CEO on it, where the CEO is an issue and the friends of the CEO kind of draw out that problem as well. So don't, you know, as the entrepreneur, don't hesitate if somebody's not working out. A lot of times, like early stage companies will set people up with, you know, stock options to be on the board in 2 or 4 year terms. I'd say make it a 1 year term and make everybody, you know, everybody's serving at your leisure, and at the end of the year, if they're not adding value, you just don't re-up them.
Yeah, and the extremes happen, but the more common is the middle, where it's a warm body,
Yeah.
and that's, you know, it's not helping, but it's it's not actively hurting, and, you know, don't get all tied up around how many options they have left. It's just far more important to get a new working person and get them out respectfully, and, you know, make sure you give them respect, because they joined your board and presumably added some value, and thank them for that, but you know, be firm about getting a person in that's really helping you. And you're right, the majority of my mistakes have been waiting too long, you know, and then you're just, you know, you average down the whole team, and you really want to be pulling the average up.
I thought, you know, I have more questions I could ask, but I actually want to see, you know, from the audience, give you guys, I mean, this is why we're here, is to help you guys have access to these kind of guys to ask. So,
What do you do about founderitis? And what I mean by that is either the CTO or the CEO was the founder of the company, and they might actually be liked, and the board might actually consider them to be doing a good job. The problem is the board doesn't ask the rest of the company. The rest of the company thinks the guy's a complete jerk, and has just been waiting for the board to fire him, and the board never gets around to it. I've actually been on both sides of that, and not as the jerk, but as the person in the company, and also been on the board, and it's really tough, you know, to figure out how to deal with it, because sometimes the CTO is the entire value of the company. I mean,
Life is short. Quit the company and work at a better one that has a better board. That's a board failure.
but do you have to wait until half the company quits?
No. I think Pascal actually pointed out something really important that a lot of boards, especially venture-backed boards, don't do, which is a formal CEO evaluation. And what I've
do that
seen
well.
done very, very well is not only the board evaluating the CEO, but we do 360s.
Exactly, and so what we do is we combine the board eval of the CEO with the 360 from the direct reports, and then we meld them, and that's when that comes up. So that's how you see to solve your problem, you have to generate awareness, right? And the
Yeah.
only way you do that is by combining these. That way you see it from both ways, and you say, oh, well, there was a complete disconnect between what the board thought and the team. Why? right? That's how you figure it out.
I'm not sure how an employee causes that to happen, though.
No, well, so that's why it should be part of the, the way that you run the company, right?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, there are very few CEOs that run formal CEO. I mean, my personal view is the CEO has to be their worst critic. And if that's
Absolutely.
not happening, you got issues. And then if that's not happening, the board has to really help with that.
Right,
But
the
if
board
that
should be doing
dynamic
it.
isn't
Yeah.
working, then it's hard to bring it in, and that's why 80% don't do it. But
Yeah.
You really just described the formula for firing Steve Jobs.
I actually, funny enough, I was thinking about that. I know quite a bit about Apple's board, and it just wasn't designed for that. And, but I think the most important, it still worked. You can't say the transition didn't work. I mean, that was a fairly abrupt transition, given whatever else happened. So, probably the most important part is you're aligned. And I think every board member on Apple's board knew, was getting into something, they knew what was going on. I don't personally agree with the way that corporate structure worked, but, that's,
And
my
that's a
decision.
unique case, but I do think, it's not about firing the CEO, it's about finding the CEO's right place.
Yeah.
And I've been in several situations, one up in Oregon, where great guy, but not a CEO, not a leader, didn't have leadership skills. He was an engineer all his life, never had any kind of training of what it's like to be a CEO. And of course, as the founder of the company, he was the CEO. But he couldn't do it. And so it's a tricky situation to manage, but we moved him over. He became head of business development, founder and head of business development. So he had founder on his business card. And the important thing is bring in a CEO that is obviously 10 times better, because then he or she can live with it and go, oh, I understand why I'm not in that seat anymore, as well as the rest of the team. The rest of the team needs to see that quality in that replacement as well.
Yeah, that's a jarring transition.
See, the thing is, there are always outliers, right? And those outliers are going to be the people who, create the most valuable company in the world, right? But what we're here to talk about is not the outliers, it's the other 99%, right? It's how do you get people to hit doubles and triples as opposed to going out of business? And see, the challenge here for the entrepreneur is that they are testing the limits of their own self-awareness, which gets back to somebody's got to give them the red pill.
Well, and funny enough, that happened at Apple, right? He got dumped.
Yep.
And it was formative in how he operated, and you can argue that the Apple that is today wouldn't have been there had he.
Yeah.
Right?
So I'm an HR professional and walked into a company and discovered a incompetent CEO and went to the chairman of the board and spent a year evaluating and reevaluating, working with the chairman of the board, and eventually removed the CEO. So there is power within the organization, and it doesn't necessarily come from the CEO and the board, because both people had blinders to their incapabilities, and so there was a real symbiotic relationship. So there is some power there.
So I have two questions, and since I've got one mic, I'm going to ask both of them at the same time. The first one is about the role of an independent director at an early stage company, one that may eventually become venture-backed. And my second question is about diversity on private company boards. There's been quite a bit of research that's been done about the performance of public boards with a more diverse board membership. I don't know whether, Pascal, in your work, you've seen any work, comparable work, about diversity in private board directors.
And so to your second, so I have not seen any work in that area, Joanne. And obviously, from our work together at Astia, I mean, it's an area, and I've backed women CEOs and have served on boards with women in venture companies. And I mean, I think it's a good thing, but I've seen no work done in this.
And then in terms of the independent, a role of an independent director for an early stage company that may become venture backed.
So again, I'm always in favor of independent directors. So
Yeah, I don't know. You're a board member. when the venture investor thinks very narrowly about their preference shares, that's a problem. When when you've got the situation where the independents are to, I have a board member, absolutely wonderful board member, who's a venture investor, Stuart Alsop. Now, I didn't let him invest in the company, so he's on the board as an independent investor. But it's really because I understood Stuart's philosophies. There were some I agreed with and some I didn't. And when he had an investment, I felt he got a little too focused on, the preference shares. So in that case, there was a distinction, and he's a phenomenal board member. When the group goes a certain direction, Stuart, if you know Stuart, he's absolutely always taking the opposite perspective, and that's a great thing to have on a board. But I don't believe there's any. The fiduciary duties are the same.
That's
and
right.
So if you're fooling yourself that an independent director has a different set of constituencies.
No, I was just thinking of, as early stage companies get going.
Yeah.
Besides putting your, don't put your friends on.
Yeah.
Still look for critical independent directors.
Absolutely.
Yeah. There's a lot of arguments over majority of independent. I'm a very opinionated believer that you have one insider and all the rest independents. Most people aren't that extreme, but I think it is important to have a majority of outside directors. That's an opinion.
I think over you in the back.
So can you compare and contrast the advantages, disadvantages of an advisory board versus a governing board, particularly for a privately held company?
Yeah, I sit on one for a public company, so, but I think the benefits are perhaps the same. So, the governance agenda is by its very nature, very focused on the fiduciary responsibility of the board. And in a very early stage company, in a venture-backed company, that's a pretty small part of the agenda, and then the board gets on with, strategy of the company and what have you. But I ran a semiconductor company years ago, a startup, that, none of the venture investors that were board members had any real semiconductor experience. And so that board meeting, while it was very useful and, it accomplished a lot of what I needed to get done in terms of moving the company forward, it lacked a significant amount of depth as it related to what was happening in the semiconductor industry. So I set up a semiconductor advisor. I set up an advisory board, which was 4 other people. They were all, very experienced and established in the semiconductor space, and those were people that I could bring in my developers into a room, and we could knock out for a day on, the depths of what we were doing in the business that, really wasn't important in the boardroom, but was important to me in moving the company forward. So I'm a big fan of it. There's work done on how do you compensate them and how many is the right people, how many people are the right number of people to have on those things. But I think what you want to do is, where you have a weakness, either, as a CEO, either in yourself or on your team or on your board, use an advisory board. It's easy to put together. People like being on them. There's, it doesn't have near the liability that being on the governance board has. And, they don't have to meet monthly. They could meet quarterly. They could meet twice a year.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. I wasn't a huge believer in board of advisors, but in the current company I work in, Sonos, we work with the music industry, and it solved a really important problem for us because we had to have a presence in the music industry, which we put people on the board of advisors. Rick Rubin is a music producer, Mark Geiger is a talent scout. The music group is at the board of advisors, and it's a really important role. But the board of directors kind of is guiding the strategic direction, watching the, hiring and firing the CEO. The one trick I'd tell you is the options treatment is different. So if you're going to compensate your board of advisors, a board of directors is looked at as employees in the company. So the way options and expensing works for the options is different for those two. So just be careful on that scale, because the the tax code and how options are treated have not caught up to Board of Advisors, so they're kind of looked at as external advisors, and they, you know, you have variable accounting and stuff like that for, I don't know if that was your experience. but-
Yep.
Sort of an operational question for really early stage companies, which we know we do have a fair number of those here in Santa Barbara. When you're out trying to raise money, how can you, or what advice would you have for enabling them to separate that from the inevitable director that's going to come with it? Because you can end up in a situation where, because you had to take the money, you have this person who doesn't work so well with some other person, but you got to have the money. And so practically, what can one do?
Have the best board possible before you raise the money, because you're in a better position if you've got a great board to have the discussion of what the person's role is on making that board better. This is one I've used very effectively in the past, because if you can look the person, that whole team in the eye as they're making their investment decision and say which person on that firm will really add to the board and make your investment. That's not a personal attack on anybody, it's open. So if you have a really good board starting, it's a great thing, but you don't have, short of having multiple investors all dying to get in, you don't have a very strong position to make that argument if you're not careful.
No, but it's really, this is one where if you have some base to help you when somebody comes in. I had, in one of my companies, a situation where, we had Bill Draper, who is one of the Hall of Fame venture capitalists on the board. We had an investor come into the company, and this was a young woman who was trying to really, prove in a lot of ways how tough she was, and she had a partnership that was giving her a very hard time. And when she came in, it looked like it was going to be great, and then pressures within their partnership spilled over into the situation. And having a guy like Bill Draper who was able to say, okay, that's enough. We get it, but that is enough, helped us get past, what was a difficult period. And in fact, now she is a terrific board member.
Mm-hmm. I agree. The board takes time to bake, and if you have if you have parental guidance on the board, it really helps.
If you can get one really good board member before you get all the stuff that comes with the money, at least when, I had that situation when I was a CEO, and have seen it a bunch of times, it makes a lot of difference, because you do get what comes with the money.
It's nearly impossible for the CEO to do that too. So it's really important to have an independent, another board that, has enough gravitas to calm them down.
Is this alive? I guess he's got the controller. The question is, you could do that with Sonos, but were you able to do that with software.com?
Yeah. I was luckily enough in that position, but actually, I'll give you a really good example. We were talking about this venture investor that is a vulture investor, or the definition of it, and Software.com almost ran out of money at one time, I think we were 90 days until I wasn't going to make payroll, and we had, 70 people. And that's a pretty scary thing. And this board member I described, who we ultimately parted ways, had brought in this venture investor, and they'd put a term sheet on the table that was so attractive, the board was arguing, well, just take it, let's not get any other offers. And it's a lot of work to get other offers. And I kept working on it. And luckily enough, what happened was this wonderful offer that was on the table when we came down to turning it into a real investment, they changed the terms. And it's really common behavior for them. He's nodding his head up and down because luckily I learned it with a way out. And I had just had a gut feeling that would happen, but I'd worked on having a backup plan, and AT&T Ventures came in and took the investment, and that was actually the leverage I used to get rid of the board member because he pushed this investment. But that company would have been in a very different path. So you have to have two. If you only have one option and it's a bad option, it's not a bad option because you only have one. And so if, it's work and you got to find another option, but that's the only, that's the only guidance I could give. Other than Frank's, which is have someone on there that will. There was one time when AT&T Ventures fell on the board, absolutely wonderful guy. But he had worked a term in the investment. I think he had a redemption term, which I now know better to never have, but or have them in a time period when we all agree. He was leveraging that, and we had Cisco as a corporate partner. Now, it all worked out great, and everybody was aligned. The situations that Pascal was talking about didn't transpire for us, but one of the things the guy from Cisco, Don Listwin, did was really said, look, if you're going to behave that way, we'll never invest as Cisco with you in another investment. Literally happened. And Neil said, well, maybe I won't do that. And it just straightened stuff out. So having some peers, and of course I could have battled with, and Neil was a completely reasonable guy. I think he was just having a bad week and got in a position where he had leverage and thought he should use it and just wasn't thinking about the big picture. But Don helped him see, that's going to do you damage, and he backed off of that and did the right thing. That's the funny thing about these boards. There's no one, there's no one thing you do right. There's no one thing these are great guidance, but each situation is a little different. And
Sarah,
Would you say that it's really important that the person who's serving on the board is the person who's making the decisions or has a lot of influence in the partnership and is not just sent as a representative and has to keep checking back?
Oh, that's a complicated answer. There's, when you've got someone, when you've got someone on the board that's a senior partner and been there forever, then that's true. But now you're getting into how the partnership works of the investor, and it's a good thing to understand if you can. But even at Sonos, BV Capital, absolutely great investment. I couldn't say enough about them. In 2008, when the downturn happened, they gave us an interest-only loan, to get through a tough period. I'm sure that the times that happens is few and far between. They're fabulous. But one of the challenges I always had with them is I really had to understand the relationship, and I had to get in and manipulate it sometimes, because the guy on our board, who is a very senior partner and strong believer, just sometimes would have conflict issues with some of the other partners, and he would agree to something. We thought we were there, and the dynamics inside the partnership didn't work, and you'd find out, unfortunately, 3 months later, long after you assumed you had agreement. So I don't know that, you just have to be aware that it's a partnership on the other side, and this is one face of the part. And ideally, it's working exactly as you described, but, it's not always ideal. There's no magic answer there.
I can give you some very concrete advice on this, which is to remember to always spend time or ask to spend time with the rest of the partnership.
That's really good
because
advice.
you get very used to the person who's on your board, and the other partners are hearing everything through a filter.
Yep.
And sometimes you're just not, you're not a person to them. You're a company with problems. And it's really important that the rest of the partnership gets some exposure to you so that they see you as a person and more than just a problem child that's there.
That's really good advice. I learned that the hard way with AT&T Ventures, and that's, if you take away anything tonight, that's great advice.
Steve?
How do you deal with the situation where you think there is a mismatch between a venture company that's going to invest and the person they feel is going to be the right board member versus the company feeling that maybe they want somebody else within the venture company to be the board member?
Oh, that's complicated.
Yeah, I mean, my experience has been that it's really difficult. See, if you go to that partnership, they will rally around the partner. You'll be counterproductive in trying to do that because, again, you're coming in from the outside, and unless they're ready to fire that partner, right? It's like you don't tell them how they assign people. So it is very, very difficult. The time when you can, again, if it's not working out, the time when you can force change is at the next financing round. And that's when, and effectively what you do is you have to, if there's a new investor, you go to the new investor and you say, you have to require a certain change and you make that happen. I mean, we once had a revolt of all the board members where we threw one guy off. And that was it. He was so out of control, we threw him off. And he was a former CEO himself. I find they're the serial abusers because they're like, you know, hey, I can do this, right? I can do this. And so they keep second guessing all the time, but they forget, well, you're not CEO anymore, you're a director now. And then they can be very abusive. But it's a really hard thing.
Yeah, it can be done, but you have to make sure that partner doesn't lose face in their partnership. So if you do that, you're in huge trouble.
And it really can't be you against him or her.
Yeah.
And the example I gave earlier, where I was in this situation, it was obvious to the other board members that this partner was not contributing in the way that he should. And so it made it a much easier conversation because, you know, the venture investors around the table talk outside of board meetings about what's going on with the company. And so they were my backup when I was looking to make that change. And it made that situation much easier than it could have been.
One of the ways you can do it is by putting some process to measure yourself as a board.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that may give you some of the concrete evidence, at least, to make what is often a very hard decision, which is to go to another board member and say, hey, this isn't working. So at least that's what we've tried to do, and I'd recommend anybody who feels that that type of situation is arising in their company to institute that process, because that'll give you at least the best chance of having a somewhat reasonable discussion about it.
Yeah, it can't be personal. If it's personal, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
What are the appropriate outside limits for board control with respect to like capital commitments, hiring, firing, and that sort of thing? And what is an appropriate consensus on a board to make those kind of decisions?
Wow. I have a pretty firm view. If a board made any commitment whatsoever on any of those things, they wouldn't be a board member anymore because that's not their role. But there are different views. You know, Silicon Valley has investors that have board members that hire and fire, and I wouldn't put up with that. But.
I mean, are you talking about board members that actually hire and fire, or board member, you know, what level of employee does a board have to approve? For example,
exactly.
Executive.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So again, typically it's, you know, it's ratifying officer levels selection, you know, selections of employees. So you don't, regular employees you don't do, but then also, you know, the comp committee needs to approve stock options, right? So again, so you just, it's pretty standard. I mean, it's with the bylaws of the company.
And there's probably signature authority levels.
Yeah.
Certain levels of employee can sign on $50,000 checks, $100,000 checks. Some stuff would come to the board. Capital usually goes to the board, even in public companies.
Is there a point at which that becomes inappropriate to create a highly board-driven company?
Well,
where the CEO is...
If you're transparent with the board, the better the better a discussion you're gonna have with every option grant of employees, every new option pool. Like, you know, Sonos, I don't know, we have 30 to 40% of our fully diluted in employee options at any time, and that's a lot. And so we're really ultra transparent with the entire board over every employee we're pulling on, what the philosophy is that's coming in. We're really inclusive because you're asking an investor to take a fair amount of dilution as measured in the absolute share sense to make the pie larger. And if they don't have transparency, it's gonna be a hard argument, and it's gonna build up because their resentment's gonna build up, and then you're gonna go ask for a new pool, and they're gonna say no, and then you're gonna be really stuck.
And as you get bigger, the requirements for this sort of oversight actually will get worse, maybe
Yeah.
from your perspective. And to the extent that you have a business that you either want to take public or you want to sell to a public company, you know, as you get close to that transaction, you have to look internally like a public company. And so you need to be thinking about what are the kinds of accounting principles and you know, approval levels and things that compensation committee behavior that, you know, the acquiring company is going to come in and look at during due diligence. And if there's a mess there,
Yeah.
it could really complicate a
Yeah,
transaction.
and you want to, because having acquired a lot of companies, there's almost always messes there that they weren't aware of if they didn't have that maturity. So, and that just screws everybody up because the acquirer doesn't want to deal with that. You didn't want to deal with that. There are things usually you can't fix simply. So the better you're kind of involving them and getting good oversight, it's a good idea.
When I
Better from my perspective. I was looking for more of a company that was run maybe more as a democracy than a autocracy from the CEO. Like to have a highly board-driven company. Is that something that ever works?
I mean, you know, that's not our job, right? I mean, if we're not there to run the company, right? So then there's something, to me, then there's something wrong.
Something wrong,
There's something
yeah.
wrong.
That's the
Good
bad
board
part of our
members don't
job.
want to do any of that. I mean, that's.
Yeah, I'd be careful. That's a lure. Like there was a time when I just really didn't feel like I was the right person to run the company, and I was relying on a couple of board members at software.com, and it became unhealthy, and we really had to have some discussions, and I had to step up, frankly, to, you know, acknowledge I had some holes and get some help in developing those skills or the team around me, because it's not good to involve the board at an operational level. Your team won't know. It's going to split your team. Do I need to go get their approval, your approval? What happens when you disagree? If you disagree within your team, you open up, you know, do I go to them and they tell you what to do? I mean, there are a lot, that's a dangerous avenue.
And if you haven't already seen the warning signs that there are problems, here's some things to look for, right? Quarterly board meetings become monthly board meetings. Monthly reports become weekly. Yeah, I mean, you know, if your board feels a necessity to start overseeing with that level of regularity, there's something wrong. And if you're not seeing it, you need to sort of look in the mirror and go, okay, they see something. Call them all into a room and say, okay, what am I missing here? Because, you know, to everyone's point up here, that's not the job of a board member. And in fact, as board members enter into that sort of behavior,
Yeah, you'll
they
scare
actually
the
put
good
themselves
ones
at
away.
risk.
Yeah, the good ones won't. They'll just kind of, you'll approach them and they'll say, no.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
From the perspective of a young entrepreneur with an early stage company that may not have venture backing, but knows that they're inexperienced and really needs a board to help provide some direction, where do you recommend starting to, you know, build that board? And also, you know, John, you talked about it may take up to 5 years to build kind of that perfect collaboration. You know, if you're an early stage company, then, you know, you may not feel like you have that luxury of the time. What would you recommend kind of doing to avoid maybe picking the wrong person just out of, you know, desperation or, you know, seeking that leadership? And then also it really intrigued me what you just said about the board not becoming too operational. You know, I could see myself very easily, you know, doing that to a board as a very, you know, inexperienced person in the business world. How do you, from a young company, avoid kind of letting yourself do that? Sorry.
There were
big
several
question.
questions.
Yeah, that was a lot.
Sorry.
I mean, the last question you asked is a good one, because there are some things as an individual entrepreneur or a team of 3 people that you do want the board to do, right? You want them to open doors, you want their Rolodex, you want them to help you find money. I wouldn't characterize those as operational.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't want to bring a board member on and have her start writing Ruby on Rails code, for your website. That's probably the wrong role. But I mean, there's definitely things that board members at that stage of a company should do and love to do. I mean, I do that all the time. I love doing that with entrepreneurs that I helped get their companies started. And there's tons. I would venture a guess that there's tons of those kinds of people in Santa Barbara. I'm up in the foothills by Sacramento, and there's dozens and dozens of people who love to do that.
Yeah, it's not wrong to find a person passionate to help your success. And, but that's different than a person that's really feeling like they want to make some calls in the company that are yours. And, characteristics to look for someone that really is, made their mark or feel like they have, and what they want to do is give back, and they're passionate in growing you. And if you're careful and you watch when you talk to the person, it'll show up. And I don't think it's bad to have someone on the board that's going to help you grow up. Becoming a co-CEO is not a good thing, right? And those are different things. I think they'll be clear. It's a little, if it's your first time, it was scary for me. There was a time I went to the board and we did a CEO search because I wasn't sure I was the right person. And after, after a few interviews with CEOs, I gave me the self-confidence. Look, there's some things I don't know. And these people know, but I know a whole bunch of things they don't, and there are going to be some gut calls they're not going to be prepared to make. And so I terminated the search, and it was a really good conversation from start to finish. I'd say some of my board members, when we terminated the search, weren't sure I was making the right call, but the board was backing it, and it was a safe environment for me. Not safe that I wasn't going to get replaced, but safe that we were going to arrive at the right thing. And so, just get people that are aligned with there's lots of people around here, that would be happy to help. SCORE helps find people. And look, if you make a bad decision, just that's where the process. That's where some of these good practices come in, because it's how you manage it out. There's no hiring manager in the world that bats 1,000, and anybody that says they are is completely not self-aware. So you'll get a bad board member, and you'll learn. And what you need to do is just kind of plan on that and have it. It's like good management of any employee. Have your expectations aligned and just handle it well, and talk about the issues if they are there, and separate and find a new one. But you just got to jump in.
Yeah, specific advice. One of the reasons you want to hire a good lawyer or a good accounting firm, or preferably both, is I found that those are very good places when you say, hey, it's kind of scary for me as a young person. I'd like to go, talk to, somebody who is the, CEO of Time Warner or something, who might live in Montecito. But, that's why if you have a good law firm or a good accounting firm, they may help you with that conversation. And you'd be really surprised how many people at that stage in their life really enjoy the process of working with somebody who's, young and excited and wants to change the world.
Yeah.
And I've been really amazed by the type of people that young entrepreneurs and I, are able to get. You just often need a little bit of help of setting up those meetings properly.
Yep.
So you're not kind of like stalking them outside at, Lucky's or something and, trying to do this, but you actually have, an introduction that allows you to tell your story. I often, don't try to mix that with trying to raise money from them at the same time.
Yeah.
Is the other piece of advice. Just, if you want them as a board member, take them as a board member and work on that relationship, because that's often the first step. So just a couple thoughts.
I have a quick question for you. Well, for CEOs that are basically working the board of directors before a meeting, getting the consensus and having the important dialogue and deliberation, and then you come to the meeting and everything goes very quickly, it's already been pre-discussed among the people he wants to convince, and so the deliberative process is taken out of the board meeting and taken into a new environment where different information and motivations and objectives may be shared. Can you speak to what's the right balance between a CEO front-running a board meeting and having a deliberative board meeting that he has not yet had a conversation about?
I have a very strong opinion on this one.
I hate it.
To jump in, which is, you don't want ad hoc conversations in your board meeting. That's how you have an ineffective board meeting that can go horribly wrong.
Yep. Yeah.
I am a big believer, and I encourage all my CEOs.
Don't surprise them, right?
Yep.
That's
No
what you're saying.
surprises.
To touch base with every board member before a board meeting. It's sort of the Japanese meeting approach, which is you've already pre-discussed a lot of the issues, you know where people stand on the issues, and you as the CEO then don't lose control of the board meeting. Where you lose control of the board meeting is where people get surprised, they get upset, they get their ego out of line, and then things spiral out of control. So I really encourage it. And if it means that your board meetings seem to go quickly, well, I can't believe in most of the startups I've been in, there aren't enough strategic issues to discuss that you can't use that time effectively.
So let me take just a little bit of the other side of that, because I agree that, no surprises. There are never any surprises. So if there's bad news, that better be communicated well ahead of the board meeting. Never wait for a board meeting. The minute you know bad news, you got to tell people, and you got to get your board involved in helping solve the problem, not let them have time to view you as part of the problem. But here's the behavior that I just loathe, where the CEO calls 3 days before the board meeting and says, I'm going to ask you guys to do this, this, and this. I already talked to Pascal, and he said yes. And so, okay. And then you get to the board meeting, and sort of everybody thinks the other person said yes.
Yeah.
And you feel like you've been worked.
Right.
And that, if it only happens once, maybe it was not a bad intention, but if it happens more than once, that's a CEO that's going to get fired.
Yeah, because you're gonna generate distrust.
Yeah.
Presumptive closes.
Exactly. There's nothing wrong with providing the information, but the value of the discussion that takes place among the four of us, as opposed to you and me and you and him and you and him, that's where all the value comes from, is from that interactive discussion. And to preclude that, in particular in a way where you're trying to sell something that is going to be controversial, bring on the controversy. That's how you find the pitfalls, right?
Yeah, if you want to give people the time to think about, there's no board decision that is, comes up now, you have to make the right decision and boom. And, time is your enemy if you want to have a good decision. So don't put people in the position where they haven't had time to think about it, because some people like to think deeply, some people are quick thinkers, some people have, and you really don't want to get into, a deep thinker having not enough time to think, because you're going to get an emotional reaction or all sorts of other behaviors. So if you don't surprise them. If you're missing your numbers, get on it and tell them and be candid about it, And they may talk before the board meeting, but that's okay. And, you'll develop a sense for what people are concerned, if you're asking for more options and that's always a sore point for a given investor, then just make sure you're telling them up front and you're saying, hey, how do we get aligned over what these things are used for, rather than arguing about, whether the pool's 3 million or 4 million. And if you get ahead of those things, and I think those are fine meetings to do outside of the board meeting, go fly to wherever they are, sit down with them so you're looking them in the eye and saying, you know, why do we have these contention issues over this? Can I understand what the core issue is and work that out with them offline? That's not an issue. It's an issue if you say, well, the 4 other board members I've talked to have all agreed, and you're going to be, you know, you're going to need to agree to this, and then they're upset, and they're really upset if they then go find out that they were told that the other 4 board members agreed, and then you're in trouble.
And they all, I mean, they do talk, right? I mean,
They do talk.
The best practice is, and they should, the best practice is an executive session at the end of the board meeting. And if you don't have that, if you don't put it on the calendar, they did. Just one other sort of adjacent topic to that, don't send the board book out the morning of the board meeting.
Yes.
You know, because we're flying or we're driving, and so, you know, 48 hours is nice, 72 is really good.
Yes.
Was there anything that you learned on a nonprofit board that you were able to later apply on a for-profit board that kind of surprised you?
I'd say it's been the reverse, that I've applied the for-profit board work to the nonprofits and really helped, because it's you know, the nonprofit boards, and I've served on a number of them, are just, you know, everybody's trying to be nice to each other, and, you know, it's really difficult because you're trying to do a good thing. But then people have their own agendas. See, this is the biggest problem on the nonprofit boards, is people have their own agendas, and they're there to promote their agendas, and then they wrote a check, and so they figure, no, I wrote my check, so you don't tell me, you know, what's in the best interest. This is what I care about. So you have these single-issue directors, and that's a huge problem. So I think that, so the number one thing that I've applied to the nonprofit boards is term limits. Right? So you have graceful ways to get rid of the dead wood. Really important.
I was going to say the only one I can think of is patience, but
You know, we're doing a lot of 360-degree evaluations for nonprofits. They probably do it more than for-profit companies. And I think it is a function of what Pascal just said. Is, you know, everybody. I'm on a board of a extremely highly functioning nonprofit that is a blood bank, and you know, everybody is there because they're helping the community, and they have a good reason for being there. But not everybody contributes at the level that is necessary. And in that environment, it's really hard for people to confront other people sort of face to face. And so our product allows people to do this online anonymously. And, you know, if you ever want to get the right answer from somebody, if you ever want, how's that saying go? If you ever want to get the truth out of somebody, put a bag over your head so that you can't see who's saying it, right? I mean, most people, and we see this in all boards, most boards don't, when it gets to the part of an evaluation where you're asking, how's the chairman doing, or how's your peer on the board doing, nobody ever wants to answer those unless it's an anonymous thing. So we're seeing a lot of nonprofits do that more so than for-profits, and that's probably something that, you know, I would hope moves into the for-profit space, because there are a lot of people who just don't want to upset the apple cart. You know, they're getting their stipend and their options, and you don't have time. I mean, a lot of what we've talked about today has gotten to sort of speed, right? Speed of decision, not waiting to replace a board member, not waiting to replace an employee who's not performing. You know, if you're working at Hewlett-Packard or Cisco, you can wait 3 years for somebody's career to develop. But when you're spending, you know, $3 million of DFJ's money and it's going to run out in 11 months or whatever it is, you don't have that time. And so you have to be much more nimble, and you have to be much more quick as it relates to people decisions. And that includes, you know, decisions on your board.
What are your guidelines for board compensation for non-public companies, beginning with startups? Because they're assuming a lot of liability. A lot of startups wouldn't offer insurance right away, and just curious to know.
I mean, my experience is that the venture investors certainly don't get options. I certainly have not, as part of my relationship with other venture firms. I'm an angel investor in a bunch of companies where I've gotten stock options as compensation, but that's been the extent of it. I've never gotten cash, nor would I ask for cash from a private start. I mean, you know, Coke Industries is a private company. If I joined that board, I'd want cash. But you know, the kind of companies we're talking about today, I would flip it around and say, if somebody comes to you and says, I want to be on your board and I want cash, I'd say run away. You know, people should want to be there because they want to contribute, and, you know, in the case of independents, because they want the value of their stock options to grow.
Right, and, you know, again, for early stage companies, you know, you've got to do the math as to what's the potential future dilution, et cetera, but depending on the stage of the company and how much anticipated future dilution, you know, you can start an independent director, get non-venture capitalist, right, in the 25 basis points to 1.25%, right, of the company, and then, you know, that typically will be either a 3 or 4 year vest, right, and so then you see how it goes, and then depending on if you have unanticipated dilution, then you may restore, you know, you do a refresh with the team as well. So that's a range.
Yeah, paying their expenses if they're traveling, that's reasonable. Cash, you know, is, and cash is not, if they're asking for cash, something's not aligned, but giving them some options, I think, is wise. And those are good ranges in my experience.
Amanda?
Hi. This has been very interesting, having a great time listening to you guys. My question is this, is fresh money that comes into a startup company, is it mostly done through convertible instruments and then turnover if certain benchmarks are made into equity?
Are you talking about angel investing, or what are you talking about?
Well, angel investing and what Pascal touched on, which is anti-dilution clauses. I'm interested in those because the things I've gotten myself completely screwed up in, all tubed because of dilution down the ride. Somebody with more money would come in. Somebody would want another seat on the board. You'd have, he's brought in fresh money, so he owns more of the company than the guys who put in the $10 3 years ago. That's an incredibly layered, stratified deal that has gotten me into trouble several times. So I don't really know what my question is, other than, do you see convertible instruments up front when you're negotiating for the money, or does an outfit like Draper come in and pack the account?
I think, you know, very early stage angels will do convertible debt.
Yeah,
it's
that's where I see
in
it.
some areas it's starting to fall out of favor, and you're starting to see the angel groups act more like VCs and wanting to price rounds. But you know, most of the angels I know, and myself included, probably 80% of the deals I've done personally have been converts that convert into a Series A with a level of discount, so I get compensated. But then I'm in with the Series A investors through the, you know, all the future rounds of dilution along with those guys. I don't know that, you know, it's venture funds. I don't know of any that have done converts, except maybe in sort of bridges, right?
In bridges, or you know, there's a whole group of, like, you know, sort of micro VCs and others that will sometimes use this.
Yeah.
But I think one of the important things you bring up, Ando, is this problem, though, that faces boards.
Right.
When you suddenly have subsequent rounds of financing is a big issue, and why having independent directors is really important, because, you know, you are going to have investors who've come in who are going to get diluted, who may not be able to play in this next round, and are going to be wanting to protect their position over their duty to the company.
Yeah.
Or you have investors who are put in a position of saying, hey, look, I'm putting in the money, I know I'm on the board, and you guys don't like this, so I can't vote on it. And that's where you want to make sure you do have independent directors in the board who can help make these decisions, where you may have 2 or 3 board members horribly conflicted in a decision, and someone has to be able to help balance the situation of, is this in the best interest of the company, or are these investors being predatory? Because they've got to answer at some point to the shareholders, did we do the right thing? Sure.
What's your opinion on board members physically showing up to board meetings as opposed to dialing in?
It's a good thing. It's a bad sign if they dial in.
Yeah, I do. I set up a schedule for the year, for rolling year or more, and there are face-to-faces and there are call-in ones, and if it's a call-in, obviously they're calling in, but if they miss a face-to-face, unless it's a good reason, if you miss a couple, you're not going to be on the board anymore, because it just doesn't make, either that person's not valuing that board membership to be physically there. And, it's a pain in the neck to fly to Santa Barbara for someone that's not here, so I can understand, but then you need a person that's present, because it's just not the same if they're always calling in.
Yep. Two of my companies were in Sacramento, and all of our investors were in Silicon Valley. And, we knew it was a hardship. There's a joke about VCs driving over the Bay Bridge, but we knew it was a hardship at times for them to come to Sacramento. So we basically set the calendar up. Every other board meeting was in San Francisco. Every other board meeting was in Sacramento. We made the schedule such that everybody was face-to-face every board meeting, but we took into consideration the fact that the VCs were all in the Bay Area, and we didn't take them out of their day as much on those alternating months.
Hey, if you can add sharing a meal to it.
Yeah,
one of the things
highly
my
recommended.
experience
Highly recommended.
is breaking bread goes back a long way.
Yep.
And when times get tough, if your board actually likes each other as people or respects each other and to like each other and have spent some time, it just means that some of the, diverse issues are more able to be bridged through personal relationship when logic or financial things might not make that bridge.
Yeah, before every Sonos face-to-face board meeting, there's a dinner the night before. I highly recommend it. Absolutely.
And I'd invite management to those,
Yeah.
not necessarily
That's
all of
exactly
them, but
right.
I'd
Yep.
invite management
Yes.
because it's
Yes.
a good opportunity for the board to get to know management
exactly
outside
right.
of
The board meeting.
the presentations. Yeah.
Because it's not, they're not on the spot to present, you're just talking. That's really good guidance.
Well, I think we've sort of, passed what our normal time allotment is here. Obviously, we're available here, to answer questions or afterwards. It's an important topic, and would love to get any of your feedback on things that, maybe next time we should make sure if we didn't cover, we should. But I really want to thank, getting three guys like this to come and join us is a real privilege, and I really want to thank, Pascal, who came down from the Bay Area and brought his A game with him. Jim, who made the effort from Sacramento, and then John, who's one of our, rock star CEOs here, to spend time to help the entrepreneurial community is just great. So let's give them a hand.
Thanks to you.
And thanks to Frank for setting this up. I told you it was for mature audiences. It's more complicated than a marriage because there are more people involved. I'd like to just quickly acknowledge two visitors from up north, Joanne Miller from Brown Dog Partners in San Luis Obispo, and Thea Chase, who is with Cal Poly, involved in all of their entrepreneurial pursuits. They made the long drive to come hear us. And thanks, everyone. Remember, next month is at UCSB, and obviously Frank has volunteered them to stay so we can all ask more questions. Thanks a lot.